Welcome to Movie Oubliette, the film review podcast for movies that most people have mercifully forgotten.
I'm Dan.
And I'm Conrad, and in each episode, we drag a forsaken film out of the oubliette,
Discuss it and judge it to decide whether it should be set free
or whether it should be thrown back and consigned to oblivion forever. Films others tend to forget. Come with us and open up the movie oubliette.
Hello everyone and welcome to Movie Oubliette. This is a cross-hemisphere podcast. My name's Dan and I'm all the way down here in Melbourne, Australia.
I'm Conrad. I'm all the way up in Cambridge, UK.
So in this podcast, we pull out a movie from the dungeons of obscurity and we review it to see whether it should be set free into the world or thrown back into the dungeons to be forgotten forever.
That's right. So Dan, how are you?
I am great. I'm doing well and I'm keeping busy. How are you, Conrad?
I'm great. It's getting warmer here, which means being cooped up in a studio recording for long periods of time is getting a little bit trickier than it was before. But yeah, it's good. I'm excited to be on episode 3 already. I can't believe that we're on episode 3.
So going back to episode 2, there was one thing that I have recently found out about. So episode 2, we reviewed Demons, which was an Italian produced film. And I was saying how Italian films, especially Italian horror, it was always dubbed over. The voice was always dubbed over. Even if it wasn't Italian, it would always be dubbed over in Italian again. And I always thought it was a cost saver. So I was talking to my sister's fiance, shout out to Ale, and he said, he's actually Italian, and he said that the majority of Italy doesn't speak proper Italian.
Oh.
So the majority of Italy actually speaks a dialect of Italian, so their local dialect. So by having all of these actors from all over Italy in a film, they would all have different dialects, so speaking slightly different versions of Italian. And so that's why they dub over with real proper Italian, in inverted commas.
Okay.
Yeah, and apparently I think up until about 15, 20 years ago, they were still doing it. And even now, especially sort of the older generation of Italians don't speak proper Italian.
Okay.
So it's very interesting.
Wow, I had no idea, because you tend to think of it as a fairly small country, but I guess it isn't.
Yeah, it's because it's so traditional. So each little town will preserve their dialect of Italian because it's been spoken in that little town for generations, and so yeah.
Well, I guess the same is true of the UK, because we're a relatively small country, really, when you look at our population and geographically, but there are so many different dialects, and certainly in American and international films, if you have somebody who isn't from London, who isn't either speaking the Queen's English or Cockney, if you have somebody from the North, they have to subtitle it, because Americans can't understand what these people are saying, which I find really amusing. Like I was watching a making of documentary on one of Christopher Nolan's Batman movies, and I think the assistant director or the cinematographer, I think it's the assistant director, is Scottish, and they had to subtitle everything he was saying on the making of, because they knew the American guys just wouldn't be able to follow what he was saying.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, what's the movie that we'll be looking at this episode, Conrad?
Well, I shall go over to the oubliette and pull something out.
Ooh.
My first time to the oubliette, actually, so I'm a little bit nervous. I think I might put on some safety gear, because these guys can bite, I think. So I'm going to put on some gloves.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Very impressed.
Some eye protection.
Oh,
okay.
Be careful.
Oh, crikey. We should oil this thing.
I know.
Okay, I'm reaching in. Okay.
Better close it quick.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Oh, what have I got? So for this episode, I have a treat for us. It's a British film. It's called Saturn 3. It's directed by Stanley Donen, who's probably best known for directing Singing in the Rain.
Yeah.
Which is odd when you realize that Saturn 3 is a science fiction movie, and it has the bizarre lineup of Farrah Fawcett, Kirk Douglas, Harvey Keitel, and a killer robot. And it was made in 1979, released in 1980. And in terms of the plot, it's about Kirk Douglas and Farrah Fawcett are these two scientists who are doing research into food production on Titan, the third moon around Saturn. And they're doing this presumably because things have gotten bad on Earth and they need food. Or I think it's mentioned that things have gotten bad back home. And they've been living a blissful existence there by themselves with their dog, Sally. But the powers that be are concerned that they need to increase production. So they send Harvey Keitel and his robot to try and speed up production. The only problem being that Harvey Keitel wasn't selected for this mission. He was actually disqualified for being mentally unstable. Unfortunately, the guy that's supposed to be going on the mission points this out to him and sort of says, "Oh, so you were found to be mentally unstable. That's bad, isn't it?" Which seems like a very silly thing to say to a person
That's mentally unstable, yeah.
Indeed, yeah. So he goads him for being mentally unstable, and then Harvey Keitel promptly straps himself down to something, opens an airlock, and blasts the guy out into space, and replaces him, and takes the mission down to Saturn 3 to Kirk Douglas and Farrah Fawcett, where, unfortunately, because of his, he becomes enamored with Farrah Fawcett and wants to split the couple up and have her for himself. And thus, tension ensues. What will happen?
And also a killer robot.
And a killer robot, because the robot learns by plugging directly into the head of the person who's in charge of them. In this case, Harvey Keitel. And he, unfortunately, leaves himself plugged in while he's gazing at Farrah Fawcett and having, obviously, some very unclean thoughts about her. So the robot ends up being similarly enamored with Farrah Fawcett and very jealous of Kirk Douglas. And this is clearly not going to end well. So
Right.
I think that is our setup for Saturn 3, a 1980 British classic.
Can't wait. Can't wait to talk about it.
Okay, let's take a break and talk about it when we come back. Okay, we're back. So, Dan, you hadn't seen Saturn 3 before. This was my pick from the Oubliette. What did you think?
I was very surprised by how disastrous this movie was. There was not a lot that was going for it that was commendable, which did make the film mostly unintentionally funny. And I pretty much every scene I was either shocked, confused, or just found hilarious.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was quite a strange film in the fact that it didn't really know what sort of film it actually was. So there was a lot of kind of campy, quite psychedelic 70s decor and costumes, but then it was a sci-fi with some horror elements as well. And then the most wooden acting I have probably ever witnessed in a film.
Yeah, it's kind of odd tonally, this movie, because on the one hand, it was conceived as a serious movie. And it is sort of, some of the dialogue, it's very po-faced and serious about trying to establish the culture that we're living in, this futuristic world in which I think the Earth has become sort of callous and cold, and because I don't know, because of the hardships there, because the movie kind of suggests that Kirk Douglas and Farrah Fawcett's relationship is kind of old-fashioned.
Yeah.
And that Harvey Keitel's character, Benson, is more...
And progressive and modern, yeah.
Yeah, taking recreational drugs and having a fast and loose attitude to sex just as a means of physical gratification. So it kind of gives you this sense that it's world building and they have their own turns of phrase for things that they're talking about, and the audience is sort of thrust into this world and you've got to pick up what they're talking about when they're talking about blue dreamers, the drug that they take for fun, and haven't you been receiving your transmissions, you're supposed to scan them, and all this kind of thing. So they're using all these sort of bits of terminology and trying to create a serious future world that we're supposed to believe in, whilst running around in Baco foil outfits. And it does look very much like a kitschy 70s, 60s Barbarella-style sci-fi movie.
Exactly.
With this po-faced dialogue.
Yeah, that because what's great about Barbarella is it just goes with it. It runs with the kitschy aspect, and it's just a fun, ridiculous, quirky movie. Whereas this was just a little bit too serious for its own good. So there are moments where you just weren't invested in the seriousness because everything that you were looking at was ridiculous.
Yeah.
I mean, even the set design just looked, I don't know, like there's the tunnel that they run through, and it's just got thousands of plastic pipes just going in everywhere for no reason whatsoever than to look science fiction, futuristic. And their clothing is, even though this was filmed in the 1979, right? It felt so 70s. Like it felt just so ingrained in 70s psychedelic, free love, hippie. It felt so dated. Like I couldn't believe it came out in 1980 because it had the kitschiness of a 50s or 60s sci-fi film, but with the psychedelic aspect of the 70s, and also it was in color with the worst acting imaginable.
And yet you compare this, because a lot of people say, well, is this derivative of Alien, Ridley Scott's Alien, which of course was produced in the UK in the same year. And this suffers so much in comparison with that, because whereas Ridley Scott, taking his inspiration from Star Wars of 2 years prior and heavy metal, has created a very lived-in environment for his characters. So when you're prowling through the Nostromo, the sci-fi corridors are there, but they're all richly detailed and they look old, so there are pipes and buttons, but it's all sort of worn down and used, and you get the sense that there's a function for all of it. Whereas this pristine obsidian corridor with
bright
blue lights down it, and then bright primary coloured extractor fan tubing running down it, you just don't believe in this world at all, do you? It's just not realistic.
No.
Well, it's just not. It's not a lived-in environment. It just looks cheap and tacky, to be honest.
I don't think there was a single scene in the entire movie where I felt like I believed in this world. Every single scene looked like a set, and every single thing in that set looked like a prop. I just felt like I was watching a movie, like knowingly watching a movie. And I never felt immersed in it whatsoever. Another thing that was quite jarring for me, because I'm a sound designer, was the sound was terrible. There was so much dubbing. I felt like almost 70 or 80% of it was just looped audio.
Yeah.
And I think when I was looking at the runtime, and it wasn't until 14 minutes into the film we actually heard location recorded dialogue.
Right.
And everything else was ADR'd. And you could tell, and it wasn't mixed well. They didn't put any reverb on any of the dialogue.
No.
It just felt like it was directly in front of a microphone, and they just threw it in there, kind of synced it up, because some of it was not in sync at all with the lips.
No, and I wonder if that's because the environment was a difficult one to record in, just because it was enclosed plasticky sets, or whether Farrah Fawcett, I get the sense, talks very softly all the time. And when she's over the other side of the room, you probably couldn't even hear her.
Yeah.
And Harvey Keitel, of course, that's a whole other story.
Yeah. So Harvey Keitel didn't want to do any of the looping? Is that...
He did not.
No. He just refused out of just sheer denial. Like, what?
I don't know. Maybe he saw the movie and thought, oh, screw this. But it's quite rare to find a movie where an actor who subsequently becomes enormously famous, and then you watch a movie where early on in their career, their entire performance has been dubbed by somebody else.
Yeah.
I mean, I can think of one other example, which is Andie MacDowell in Greystoke, The Legend of Tarzan, where her entire performance is dubbed by Glenn Close. That's just when you watch it now, it's a really jarring experience. People have said, I've read in reviews, that Harvey Keitel's Brooklyn accent being entirely erased by the mid-Atlantic stylings of a guy called Roy Dotrice, who passed away in October last year, and probably people listening to this might recognize him from Game of Thrones. I've read reviews that suggest that the juxtaposition just makes his character creepier. But I'm not sure I buy that, to be honest. I think it just makes it weird.
Yeah, he did a pretty good job sounding quite similar to Harvey Keitel, though. I didn't actually pick up on it during the movie, and it wasn't until after that, when I read about the production, that I realized that, it wasn't even Harvey Keitel.
Yeah, in terms of the job he did, it was pretty good in terms of just creating something that was of the same timbre as Harvey Keitel, but doing the performance that obviously the director subsequently decided that he wanted.
Right. I guess we have to touch on the actual production of this film, because that's a big reason why the film is the way it is.
Yes, we do. And this has been talked about in great detail by a fan of the film, super fan of the film, Greg Moss, who has a website called Making of Saturn 3 and did the commentary. There's a reason why there's so much material on this, is because it's pretty fascinating. So the film was started by John Barry, who is a production designer. He's often incorrectly attributed to the James Bond movies, just because John Barry, the composer, worked on many of the James Bond movies. But he didn't actually do any of those. But he did the production design for Superman, for Star Wars. He's pretty well known and well respected, and he wanted to try his hand at directing. He wrote the original story. His story was turned into a script by Martin Amis, who is a British novelist, son of Kingsley Amis, which I think is his only screenplay credit. So he obviously had one go at it and decided, won't try that again. And the film went into production, but I think there are varying reports on why it was that John Barry was eventually supplanted by the producer, Stanley Donen, who wasn't comfortable with sci-fi at all and clearly didn't find his feet, really, when you look at the result.
I mean, he'd done no sci-fi films previously, had he?
No, and he had no affinity for it when John Barry brought it to him, because they'd worked on a movie prior to that together. He recognized that it could be an intriguing concept, but he didn't want to do it himself. So he really wasn't comfortable at all, and you can tell, I think.
Yeah.
But as for why Stanley Donen replaced John Barry, you can pick a variety of different stories. You've got Kirk Douglas being not very cooperative, possibly with the underlying motivation that he wanted to direct it himself. You've got John Barry not being very experienced and not doing a very good job because he'd just done set design before and never had really directed actors or set up shots or anything like that.
Yeah, sure.
Which is, I'm not sure whether that holds true because he did second unit work on the Star Wars movies and actually went back to doing second unit work for The Empire Strikes Back after he departed the set of Saturn III. So there are varying reports. I don't know which one of them we choose to believe, but
Yeah, sure.
it was a fraught situation, and what makes it particularly sad is that after John Barry left and he was working on Empire Strikes Back, he became ill and subsequently died at a pretty young age.
Yeah, I think he was only 43 when he died.
Yeah.
And I think he contracted a rare case of meningitis.
Yeah.
That's very, very saddening.
It is sad, and I think there was some comments around the time that, nobody else caught it, and maybe he was just run down as a result of his experience on Saturn III, that he'd had such a grueling time of it that his immune system had been compromised, and as a result he succumbed to something that he may have otherwise had recovered from. But
yeah,
who knows? It's all speculation, but it makes for a fraught working environment for the film.
I'm surprised they even finished it, really.
Yeah, under the circumstances, you would think if you're bleeding money, and I mean, the background to this is that this is an ITC production. It's produced by Lord Lugrade, who was involved in television a lot in the UK, particularly the Super Marionation productions of Jerry Anderson. And was sort of trying his hand at being, I don't know, a Dino De Laurentiis style movie mogul as well, and was producing a couple of films at the time, Saturn III, which obviously is a disaster, or was a disaster,
Yeah.
and Raise the Titanic, which also proved to be a disaster and was going over budget. I think he was quoted at the time for saying it would have been cheaper to lower the Atlantic than to raise the Titanic, which I find quite funny. So he's got two productions that are going off the rails, and he's cutting the budget of Saturn III, and I think you can see the effect of that on the special effects.
I mean, at the same time, if you look at the actual budget of Saturn III, it's pretty baffling that this was the result of, I think it cost $9 million.
Yeah, I think some reports say it overran to 10, so...
Apparently that was pretty much the same budget as Alien.
Right.
So you can see why I'm confused.
Yeah, just look at the talent on show, the sort of genre-defining imagery that you got from Alien compared to Kirk Douglas and Farrah Fawcett jogging in 70s outfits through a piece of plastic tubing. It's just...
But even some of the scenes were quite cool. Like some of the miniatures of the spaceships were quite good. Like especially the opening scene was actually very grand, and the music was huge. And I was actually looking forward to this film. But as soon as it got down to the actual sets that weren't the miniatures, then I got very disappointed.
Yeah, the opening is, of course, an enormous spaceship looming overhead, an entering shot and looming overhead. So it's just a complete rip-off of Star Wars.
Yeah. I thought it's still impressive, though. Still impressive.
It's still impressive, and certainly Alien opens fairly similarly. The Nostromo does go overhead, although it's in the second shot, not the first. But the special effects for the journey to Saturn III have been criticized because the design of the spaceship the landing craft is interesting. It looks like a fly almost.
It does. That's what I actually thought. I actually wrote that down. Spaceship looks like a fly.
Yeah, so far.
I didn't understand the asteroid bit because he looks like he's on water, and the asteroids are floating rocks.
Yes.
That's what I thought I was looking at, but
yes, that's exactly what they did. They're pulling a small model jerkily through a tank. And I actually think, because people criticize this, I actually think the imagery is kind of interesting because I've certainly not seen that as a depiction of flying through Saturn's rings before.
No. I mean, I felt like a lot of the effects just made you think, oh, I can see exactly what they're doing here. That's an effect.
Mm,
So like some of the other miniatures with the spaceships, they just looked like miniatures.
yeah.
Or when he was flying over the moon and you could see the terrain, it looked like a model moon.
Yeah, it really
They
does.
just didn't pull it off.
It's not detailed enough and it's not lit and shot in the way that makes you convinced that there's any kind of scale here.
Yeah.
It looks like what it is, which is about, 1 meter by 2 meters of plaster. It's terrible.
I also liked that when they get into the moon and in the science lab that they're in, everything just seems to be. I felt like they must have bought maybe I don't know 1 million LEDs and just thought let's put them on everything because there just seemed to be lights everywhere. Like the cameras, the security cameras just looked like 3 LEDs attached to a piece of Lego. It didn't look like a camera at all.
No, it doesn't. And everything looks brand spanking new. I don't know how long Kirk and Farrah have been on this planet, but it looks like they just arrived yesterday and pulled off the shrink wrapping. It all looks brand spanking new. Which again, you compare that to Star Wars and Alien, and it's just so unconvincing as a way to build a world for this drama to take place in.
Yeah. I felt that Harvey Keitel's character, so his name was Captain Benson?
Benson, yeah.
Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. His character just didn't. I mean, I understand he had mental issues, he was mentally unstable, but there was no reasoning behind it. He just seemed crazy for the sake of crazy, and there was not an ounce of just normality in him whatsoever. So I just didn't buy it. And he had no motivations at all. He just seemed like a very randy kind of guy that just wanted to get in the sack with Alex.
With Alex,
Alex
yeah,
character.
Farrah Fawcett's character, Alex, who seems like she falls into the trope of the born yesterday but born sexy sci-fi trope, the same as Fifth Element, which is kind of dodgy when you think about Fifth Element, that essentially this character is sexy, but she was just created a day ago. And so she's a child, really.
Yeah.
But Farrah Fawcett has that sort of ingenue innocence about her. She's never been to Earth.
No.
I don't know whether she's been living on the moon all of her life or she's just never been back to Earth. And she's curious about Earth. But Kirk Douglas, who is the grizzled veteran, sort of warns her away from it. This is why we've escaped Earth. This is why we don't live there. So I wonder whether Benson's character is meant to be suggestive of this is what Earth is like now. This is sort of the culture there. People are just callous and cruel and selfish and purely hedonistic. And
Yeah. But he's completely cold.
yeah,
Like he has no emotions whatsoever.
no. And the deadpan voiceover contributes to that completely.
Yeah, it surely does. Also, the age differences of the actors,
Yeah.
it's quite huge,
It
right?
is.
So Kirk Douglas was 64, I believe, and Farrah Fawcett was 33, and then Harvey Keitel was 41.
Yeah. So I think Farrah Fawcett, I read somewhere she turned 32 on set, which would make her exactly half Kirk Douglas's age. I'm not sure
Right, yeah.
which is true, but it's a pretty big gap.
Yes.
Sort of 30 odd years. And I was looking up other age differences, and obviously probably the most famous is Woody Allen with his leading ladies.
Yeah, don't get me started on Woody Allen.
Really? Are you not a fan of Woody Allen?
Yeah, he's very hit and miss, and mostly misses, I have to say.
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot of his films. The only one that I saw that I enjoyed was Everyone Says I Love You. And I only love that just because of the scene where he's with Goldie Hawn dancing in front of the Seine in Paris and she starts to fly,
Oh.
because that sort of thing makes me go all sort of sappy. I kind of like that.
Yeah, I haven't seen that one.
It's fun if you want to see people who really shouldn't do musical numbers attempting musical numbers. It's great fun for that because it's a musical. So you've got Julia Roberts trying to sing, which is just priceless. But yeah, in other films like Husbands and Wives, he's 56. Juliette Lewis, who's his love interest, is 19. So that's 37 years in terms of a gap.
Yeah.
Or in Entrapment, Sean Connery and Catherine Zeta-Jones, I think the age gap there is 39. So there have been worse age gaps, but it's pretty marked here. But it's even a plot point, isn't it? And I think it was intentional.
Yeah, it was. So Kirk Douglas's character was an old man and he needed to retire, and Harvey Keitel's character was the new young upstart at 40 years of age that was going to take his place.
Yeah, and he even says at one point, he says to Alex, doesn't it disgust you to be touched by him? So it gives you a sense of how shallow and, I don't know, how cruel and heartless either he is or society on Earth is. Because the only thing that we're told is that he's mentally unstable. We're not necessarily told that he's an asshole.
Yeah, I don't know. I felt like maybe they should have shown Earth and shown the people of Earth so that we had a gauge of what humans were like now. Because apparently they were very different to Kirk Douglas and Farrah Fawcett. I keep forgetting the character names. Adam and Alex's characters on the moon.
Yeah, it's very odd. And as a dynamic, I'm not sure it works because you've got Harvey Keitel being a cold fish who for some reason he's just arrived and his opening gambit is, you're disgusting old man. Because he even has the scene where he walks in on them when they've just had sex and says, I'm leaving and I'm taking Alex with me.
Yeah.
As if that's going to be okay. Under what circumstance does he think that's going to be fine?
Yeah, I know, exactly. I did like that scuffle that ensued after where Kirk Douglas is wrestling with him completely naked.
Yeah.
Which apparently Kirk Douglas just wanted to take his clothes off for all the scenes.
Yeah, Martin Amis said subsequently that when actors get old, they just get obsessed with being naked on screen for some reason. I'm trying to think of other examples where I've seen that happen. I can't think of any.
No, I can't. I've never seen a naked scuffle before. That was interesting. I mean,
it's a bold statement.
Yeah. So the movie was trying to. I felt like the film was quite like it was like watching an exploitation film at times, because Farrah Fawcett's character is wearing next to nothing all the time.
Yes, and exposing her breasts quite often. And there's a lot of talk about her body, and Kirk Douglas has this whole thing where he says, you'd slowly undress and I'll try to maintain my composure. And it's kind of set up as a game between a loving couple, but it does objectify Farrah Fawcett a great deal. I mean, other than she loves her dog Sally, she loves Kirk Douglas, but we're not told why. And she's sort of quizzical about Earth. She doesn't really have much agency in the movie. In fact, a lot of the movie is just putting her in jeopardy.
Well, I mean, they're supposed to be scientists, right?
Yeah.
And they're researching plant growth, hydroponic growth of plants, but there wasn't a great deal of sciencey business going on. There was a lot. Instead, there was a lot of sleeping, having sex, and just kind of exercising and walking around.
Yeah, you can understand why they're a bit pissed with their productivity rate, can't you?
Exactly.
We've got to do something. Let's send down a robot. Yeah, she was a molecular biologist and was a genius, and we got to see her hard at work, but she just seemed to sort of saunter around in a variety of bizarre clothing and pet a dog.
Yeah, exactly. So we have to talk about the killer robot.
We do.
Hector.
Who, of course, I looked up thinking this must have some inner meaning, within the context of this. Maybe Adam is supposed to be the first man, and Alex is kind of an Eve, and Benson is Satan, and I don't know. And Hector is from Greek mythology, and he was the greatest warrior of Troy, and that's it. I couldn't see anything that was being mobilized here in terms of meaning.
No. So they did mention it in the film as well. They did talk about Hector being named after the greatest warrior and was killed by Achilles and dragged around the city. But there wasn't any similarities to the film. There was no parallels whatsoever. It just seemed almost pointless.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, I think that's a fair summarization.
So this killer robot is made up of children's brains? Is that right?
He has a very, very, just ridiculously large test tube.
Yes.
I think it's the biggest test tube ever seen on film, filled with fetus brains that look oddly like marshmallow, suspended in water.
Yes.
And this is plonked inside an oversized robot body that supposedly was designed based on Leonardo da Vinci's anatomical sketches.
Oh, right.
But I looked up Leonardo da Vinci's anatomical sketches and I can't see Hector in there anywhere. I don't know. But
I mean, I can maybe see some similarities because there was a lot of wiring and tubing that kind of suggested, muscles and I guess that sort of thing. But he didn't have a head.
No.
And I felt like that was a mistake because...
Well, he had a stalk, didn't he?
Yeah, he had a little stem that came out with two little LED eyes. But it made it look laughable and it was supposed to be menacing and terrifying, but every time I saw her, I just laughed.
Yeah.
And it's almost like, it's like if they'd made the alien creature this huge, disgusting creature, but then made his face just two little tiny eyes on a tiny little stalk. Like, it doesn't make any sense. It's not terrifying. And also his mobility was very limited. So that was another hilarious thing because he just didn't move fast anywhere.
No, he lumbered, and I didn't really understand the threat that he posed. You would have thought with a good sprint, and the two of them were jogging plenty of the time. You would have thought with a good sprint they could have kept ahead of him until his batteries ran down. There's a scene where to demonstrate his abilities, they get him to pick up a can.
Yeah.
And he picks it up fine, and then as he turns around and goes to hand it to somebody, he crushes it. But that doesn't make sense at all, because if he were going to crush it, he would have done it when he was first trying to figure out what a grip would be.
Exactly.
He would have crushed it then, but instead he picks it up perfectly delicately, then sort of displays it and crushes it at that point and destroys it. So then everybody says, ooh, obviously some fine tuning to do here. I didn't understand the threat that he posed particularly.
No, I just found him hilarious. There was one scene where where Hector was playing chess. They actually looked quite good. And apparently that scene was one of the few scenes that John Barry directed before he left.
That's still in the
production.
movie. Yeah.
But everything else, no.
No, I think he was supposed to be seeing the slow decline in Hector's mental state as he's plugged into Harvey Keitel more and more often for his training sessions and picking up all of this pent-up jealousy and insanity. And that could be an interesting story. I mean, certainly one of the things that I find most interesting about Peter Hyam's 2010, the sequel to 2001, I don't know if you've seen that.
I have.
Is that the eventual explanation for why Hal killed everybody in the first movie, which was never really explained at the time, was because he was instructed to lie. He was supposed to ensure that the two astronauts on the Discovery didn't find out about the monolith. And logic dictated that the only way he could think of doing that was to kill them.
Yes.
Because they'd never find out if he killed them. The whole idea of computers not being sort of insane, cold, homicidal maniacs for no reason, it's because they reflect their creators, that they inherit the worst aspects of humanity, and that's why they end up going off the rails in machine on the loose movies like this.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. But Hector as a prop is just so unexpressive that you just don't get much from this lumbering piece of prop work that apparently cost $1 million to make.
I know.
And I can't see where the money went, to be honest.
Apparently it needed 20 crew members to work it as well. And most of the movements were operated with radio signals. I felt like they went too far. Like, if they had created a robot that was very simple, like even something from the original Lost in Space, something that had some sort of way of expressing communication well, because this Hector didn't even speak until right at the end of the movie, and even when he did speak, it was just the voices of Harvey Keitel's character, with no effects on it, so it didn't sound like it was this scary robot version of his voice. It was just his voice. So I didn't believe it.
No.
So a huge waste of money and very laughable.
It is, yeah, and it's very difficult to generate any kind of suspense. I mean, you had moments of jeopardy where Alex was picked up by Hector by her arms and just hoisted above the ground because the robot's 8 feet tall. So until somebody comes in and manages to calm the robot down or something, I don't know. And there's a scene where, of course, the dog gets it early on. Hector kills the dog. I'm not entirely sure why. He seems embarrassed about it, though. He's sort of
I know. He's sort of sauntering in the bushes.
He is sort of like doing the Homer Simpson disappear into the bushes thing. Yeah. So you have a few moments of jeopardy early on. But then the third act tries to be sort of really exciting. So it comes to a crunch point with naked Kirk Douglas battling Harvey Keitel, and Harvey Keitel rendering Kirk unconscious by cold cocking him and trying to drag Farrah Fawcett away. And then Hector intervenes because although they've disassembled Hector because they recognize that he was going off the rails, he has reassembled himself.
Possibly the most boring reassembly. Well, I guess they were trying to make it horrifying, but it was just boring and very slow, and bits just slowly getting put back together.
Yes. This was supposed to be thrilling. And as well as that, you can tell that every single shot is in reverse because they clearly could not get the robots to position the various bits of Hector correctly. So they just had to get the robots to pull the things away because that was the only way to get it to work. So yeah, he's reassembled himself and he intervenes between Benson's attempt to abduct Alex, which is a scene I find really peculiar because, spoiler alert, he attacks Benson and he just seems to put his hand up when Benson throws a punch or karate chops him. I'm not sure what he's trying to do. And Benson's hand just comes off.
I know. Yeah, just severed, just like that.
Just like that. And then you end up with this
obviously rubber hand on the ground.
And I'm just thinking, well, either Hector's upgraded himself and put razors on his hands, or Harvey Keitel is a very delicate man who just shatters at the slightest contact with a metal object. I don't know.
There were a few horrifying scenes like that severed hand scene, and the scene at the start when Harvey Keitel ejects that guy into space and he explodes into... He seemed to turn to terracotta and just explode into orange shards. Anyway, I actually really like those scenes, even though they were ridiculous, but they were kind of shocking and unexpected, and I wish there was more of that. But there wasn't.
Yeah, it woke me up. That was the thing I was going to say, because I got an hour in and thought, God, is this movie going anywhere? And then that scene happened with the severed hand, and I thought, actually, this is quite shocking.
Yeah. exactly.
And you have a scene of Alex and Adam, once they've recovered from the shock of this, sort of looking down their foreboding dark corridors of
Yeah.
plastic tubing, trying to figure out where is Hector and can they get to the escape ship in time. And I thought, okay, this is actually quite interesting now. But again, it didn't really live up to the suspense that it attempted to generate.
I felt like they were going full steam ahead, and then they just decided to take a break.
Yeah.
You know, they were running away. They were about to go in the spaceship, and then it explodes, and then they just return back dejected, a little bit sad. But there was no tension anymore. There was no suspense. It was as if they'd just given up, and they're like, "Oh well."
Yeah.
Back to the space station then. Back to the killer robot.
Yeah, let's just go back to the room with all the buttons. And I think there's even a deleted portion of the scene where they're sat in the control room where Alex begins to laugh uncontrollably because she's remembering an earlier scene where they took drugs and Kirk Douglas was wearing her scarf.
Oh, is that what that was on about? Because they took the drug, but nothing happened. It just...
Yeah. So the version that I watched did have the drug taking scene in it.
Didn't have that in my version.
So I got to see Alex in her coming out outfit, which, my goodness, as Kirk Douglas points out, you're definitely coming out of that. It's this ridiculous PVC Barbarella costume that Farrah Fawcett is clearly uncomfortable wearing. And I think her influence is one of the reasons why it's not in most cuts of the film.
Oh, right.
And the two of them are just behaving ridiculously as though they're smashed out of their brains. And Kirk Douglas is prancing around with this sort of chiffony scarf around himself. So you have a deleted portion of that scene where they're in the control room at the very end, where Alex just bursts out laughing, remembering this happy time that they had a few days ago. And I think,
What?
hang on, let's just backtrack a little bit here. You're trapped on a space station with a robot that is clearly homicidal, and you have no way of escaping because the ship just blew up. And you're just going to sit in the control room and have a bit of a giggle about that hilarious cross-dressing moment you had earlier.
There was another horrifying scene that was when Hector, the robot, he drags away Benson with his severed hand, and he takes off his face and puts it on his own face. But
Well, he didn't have a head. You were complaining earlier that he didn't have a head, and now you're complaining when he steals Harvey Keitel.
I mean, I did like that scene because I was so shocked by it. But then they didn't show it again. He didn't continue to have Harvey Keitel's head. He just went back to his two little LEDs.
Well, supposedly it was like a suspense moment because they hear Harvey Keitel's, Roy Dotrice's voice over the intercom system, and Benson's face comes up on the monitors, and they think, oh, he's alive.
Yeah.
Hector hasn't killed him. And he says, yes, I've got the situation entirely under control. Come and see me. But notably, he doesn't say that on screen. His face disappears after the fleeting glimpse. So they're lulled into a false sense of security, thinking that everything's okay, leave the control room, and lo and behold, no, Hector's just ripped Benson's head off and plonked it over his eye stalks. And has finally found his voice and is imitating Benson.
Yeah.
And this was supposed to be like a big, shocking moment. And I guess it is. It works as that.
I mean, it was. I just wish they'd continued with it. Like that final climactic scene, I wished it was Harvey Keitel's head on top of that robot. That would have been terrifying. I did actually quite like the final scene though, with spoiler alert, Adam jumps into a pool of something, chemicals. Not entirely sure what that chemical was, with the robot and some sort of explosive, and then they just explode.
Yes.
And what a huge and magnificent explosion that was as well. I was really impressed by that. But I kind of expected bits of Adam to be flying around as well. But no, it was just bits of Hector the robot.
Just bits of Hector. And yes, it's surprisingly coquettish about showing too much gore. I think there was a scene in the movie originally where it was a parody of Benson disassembling Hector. There was a scene where you saw what Hector did to Benson.
Oh, wow.
Where you see the robot pulling Harvey Keitel's arms off.
Oh, my God.
And pulling off his head.
Yeah.
Now, there are two reasons for removing that scene. One, it ruins the whole surprise of the scene where Hector fools them into to coming downstairs.
Yeah.
But also, apparently, Lord Lou Grade was appalled by the violence. So there were various moments of violence that were excised. So you'll notice that when Hector is sort of chasing them around the station at the end, he is covered in gore.
Yeah.
When they're in the sort of walkways underneath the walkways, which I didn't understand. So they've pulled the grating up and they're running around underneath the tunnels. So there are miniature tunnels under the tunnels for some reason. I'm not sure why. But they're running around in there, and whenever he's sort of reaching down and trying to grab them, there are sort of bits of red tendrils and
bits of Harvey Keitel
hanging off him. I mean, that scene actually prefigures a similar scene in Aliens, I noticed, because that whole thing of somebody being stalked under a grilled section of the floor is very much like Newt being chased by the alien queen in the finale of Aliens. Yeah, so it's surprisingly toothless, really. It's supposed to be a shocking, horrifying movie, and it was still R-rated, but a lot of the opportunities for shocking gore and violence were removed.
Yeah,
and definitely it's an oversight that Kirk Douglas isn't among the debris that flies up in the final explosion. Because he should be. He really should be.
Yeah, he should be.
Coming to you live from the Movie Oubliette Theatre, it's the prestigious Mobley Awards.
Yes, it's time for the Mobley Awards, where we nominate some favourite elements from this episode's movie in a number of fantastic categories, starting with, of course, favourite quote. So Dan, did you have a favourite quote?
So, most of the dialogue was outrageous.
Yes, and awful.
So my favourite quote was from Benson, so played by Harvey Keitel, and he says to Alex, Farrah Fawcett's character, "Yes, you have a great body. May I use it?" I mean, it's such an awkward and just inappropriate thing to say, and it came out of nowhere as well. I was laughing a lot at that.
Yes, me too. That's exactly the one I've written down. They've only just met as well. I think this is like their second conversation after being introduced is, "You have a great body, may I use it?" Which again is indicative of the callous, hedonistic, free society that Earth has become. But yeah.
There was another quote that was a close second. So Benson has just arrived on the moon and he's holding the big test tube of brains and Adam says to him, "I'll take that," and Benson just says, "No." It's not how people act in real life, I guess. And so yeah, it was just ridiculous.
No, and he says to him, "No tactile contact." And I thought, what other kind of contact is there than tactile?
It's true. It's very true.
So, most 80s moment, and I have a particular favourite for this, which is the explosion that you mentioned.
Yeah.
I think it's a particular 80s phenomenon that whenever there's an explosion, there should be 300 cameras on it from different angles at different frame rates, and we should watch them all.
In slow motion as well.
In slow motion, yeah. Any explosion has to be viewed for about 3 minutes from every possible angle because it's only going to happen once, and I don't know, it was expensive. So
I felt like each angle, it didn't feel like we were looking at an explosion. It felt like they'd just thrown robot parts in the air and buckets of water.
yeah.
My favorite 80s moment was, well, I didn't actually find it very 80s, to be honest. I found it more 70s. So I felt like my favorite 70s moment was just the costumes, all of them. Yeah. They had a costume change almost every scene, and everything looked remarkably comfortable. So apparently Kirk Douglas took home the clothes from the set because they were some of the most comfortable clothes he'd ever worn. And they did look comfortable.
They did, yeah. They were having a nice time, weren't they? Moving on from clothes then, what about hair? What's your nomination for best hair? I mean, you're in a movie starring Farrah Fawcett.
She wins. Really. She wins.
Although, surprisingly, she has straight hair in this movie, whereas she was famous for, certainly during the Charlie's Angels period, for this, not exactly an 80s perm, but certainly very feathery, curly.
Yes, yeah. She has that in the final scene when, after everyone explodes and she goes back to Earth, she has a big cascading curly locks.
Yeah, she does. Yeah, and she does in the Barbarella outfit that was cut from the movie as well.
Oh, damn, I missed that scene.
You did, yes. Look it up on YouTube.
I will.
I actually thought that in the scene after Benson's been attacked by Hector, Harvey Keitel, who has his hair sort of pulled back into a pretty severe, not a man bun, it's like a ponytail.
Yeah.
But it comes loose. So he has sort of this feathery, almost Rachel from Friends look. Briefly. And I thought that was quite a special moment that almost got him a best hair nomination. But it has to be Farrah Fawcett, I think.
For sure.
Favorite scene?
I just liked all the horror scenes, really, because everything else was really
just atrocious.
I did find the exercising scene funnier than it should have been, I think. Kirk Douglas is skipping, and he's trying to do these double jumps, but he's really struggling, and it really shows.
Yeah, and yet the whole point of the movie and the reason for his nudity supposedly was to show how virile he still was at 64. I mean, it has to be said, Kirk is still with us at time of recording. He is 101.
Holy shit, really?
He is 101,
Wow.
whereas Farrah Fawcett, bless her, is no longer with us. She fell foul of cancer and died the same day as Michael Jackson. So she didn't really make the headlines, bless her. Very sad. Most cliched horror moment.
Well, it was barely a horror movie.
So maybe most cliched sci-fi moment.
Yeah, I guess the whole ejecting a person into space is very cliche sci-fi. Pretty much happens in every single sci-fi movie set in space. But they don't normally turn into terracotta and then explode into small shards. So that was interesting. How about you?
No, they usually blow up and explode. No, I think that was exactly what I'd written down as well. Yeah, explosive decompression or airlock moment is definitely a favorite of sci-fi of the late 70s and the 80s. Favorite special effect?
I would say Hector was my favorite laughable special effect because he was ridiculous in every scene. They just put too much into him. They just needed to simplify him. That's all they needed to do. But no, they put tubes and wires and LEDs and everything that you could buy at your local electronics store. And they all shoved it into this $1 million robot that was horrible in every scene he was in. How about you, Conrad?
Well, I think it's probably the hand coming off because it is a bit of a shock, not least because you're surprised that Benson is quite so fragile. But the head doesn't look a lot like Benson It does look like a head, I'll give them that.
Yeah.
But no, I don't know really. There are some optical effects in it that are particularly dodgy. Like early on, there's a scene aboard the spaceship that Benson comes from. And it's supposed to show this sort of futuristic, weird gravity situation where people are walking along this enormous hallway on the ground, but they're also up on the ceiling. But my eyes just couldn't make sense of that shot because obviously they only had one piece of the set and they lit it the same way and just flipped it and filled the screen with it like a kaleidoscope.
Yeah.
So I was just staring at it thinking, my eyes just cannot make sense of what this shot is.
I was quite confused with that. I thought, oh wow, this is going to be a very arty experimental film. But nope, it wasn't.
No, it really wasn't. Okay, sound effect. Do you have a favourite or worst sound effect? I've always got worst ones.
Worst sound effect for sure was Hector. They had this really high-pitched kind of sound for whenever he moved, I guess. You only really heard it when there was close-ups of his tiny little face. So I was
wasn't moving.
Yeah, I was really confused because when he was moving, like walking down the hallway, you could only hear very slow footsteps and nothing else. So none of that real cliche robot sound. But there was still that really high synthetic noise for his face. It was horrible. Very badly mixed in the entire film, by the way.
Yes.
Very obnoxiously loud sounds when they shouldn't have been that loud.
No, and otherwise just deathly silence, I think, again.
Yeah. And you, Conrad, favourite sound?
Well, unfortunately, I just have worst again. It's always the same. Maybe we should change the category. But it's when the rocket, Benson's rocket, is landing on Saturn III, and the boosters fire to sort of control his descent, and you get the oldest stock thunder sound effect that's ever existed comes out of first of all, that is not the sound that I expect a rocket to make.
Right.
And second of all, that thunder sound effect,
Was it Castle Thunder?
is it the one that
Maybe.
that one?
I remember
Yeah.
like Castle Thunder was the only thunder sound they used for many years in movies.
Yeah.
It might have been that. I didn't pick that. Interesting.
You have to go back because it's nearly as bad as the Wilhelm scream, I think, just in terms of being overused.
Yeah, for sure. I have to say that the sound in general was horrendous in the entire film, and I actually wrote down the sound mixers' names so that I can vilify them. So the sound guys involved in this film, the dubbing mixer, Jerry Humphreys, and the sound mixer, Derek Ball. Horrible sound mixing. The dubbing mixing was the worst I've ever heard in a film. And the guy that did all the electronic sound effects, did they just get hold of one modular synthesizer for a day and just spend a day churning out the most generic synthesized sounds possible, and then they threw it at this movie?
Yep.
Because that's what it sounded like. And it didn't sound like it came from the 80s. It sounded like it came from the 50s. Very disappointed.
Yep. So shame on those named sound designers.
Exactly.
And as always, our final category is the star rating for Fake Blood. Although we've never actually given star ratings so far. We've just talked about the blood. I mean, it's 80s bright red blood. It's not quite 70s thick paint. It's more that sort of glistening, translucent blood that I used to get at Halloween in little squeezy bottles and put on my fake plastic vampire fangs.
Yeah, but there wasn't a lot of blood anyway.
No, not at all.
So-
I think we've said that quite a lot, haven't we? So
No,
far?
we haven't really seen a blood-filled movie yet.
Yet there's still time.
So I give this one a half star for blood,
Yeah, half star for effort.
or lack of it.
Okay, and that is the Mobley Awards.
If I could say anything good about the film, I would say that the score was actually quite good. I quite enjoyed the score.
That's Elmer Bernstein, yeah.
Elmer Bernstein did the score. Apparently, there was an over an hour's worth of music, but they just cut it down, and I think there's only, 10 minutes or something in the entire film of actual music.
Which is a wise decision, I think, in a lot of cases, because the scene where the film sort of turns into its third act and Benson's hand is removed and Hector drags him away and you think, oh dear, we're really in some jeopardy now. That is unscored. There is no music in that scene, and it actually makes it more frightening.
That's true.
Or in as much as it is frightening.
Yeah.
Elmer Bernstein actually took a different approach with this score, and he was a bit disappointed that they cut so much of it out because he went with rock for quite a lot of it.
Right.
So if you can imagine late 70s rock in this movie.
Like sort of Tangerine Dream kind of, or...
Well, I think it was more acoustic. I mean, you can hear electric guitars in there. So
really?
That sort of that diddle-a-dee, diddle-a-dee. Every time you see Hector when he's rebuilding himself, you've got the orchestra and you've got a male voice choir chanting hummus, as far as I could tell.
Yeah,
hummus,
I thought that was
hummus.
Quite strange thing to be chanting.
It can't be that. It must be something in Latin.
I quite like that though. I did enjoy the score that was there. Often it was quite mismatched though. The music would be terrifying, and then it would just be shots of Hector.
Lumbering along.
Exactly. Now it's time for random trivia.
Oh, it's one of the most exciting times in the pod. It's the time that Dan tells us something about this film that we may not have known.
So we've mentioned most of the things I was gonna say.
It's such a peculiar movie.
Yes, but I do have to say that this movie took 79 craftsmen and 4 months to build the set. And it was so huge, apparently, that the first few days of shooting, the crew just kept getting lost. And they had to post maps all over the set just in case. So it's impressive that the movie has such an immense set, but it's a shame that it looks so shit. Yeah, good work.
Which is kind of a theme with this movie, isn't it? Well, with Hector costing $1 million and looking like a lumbering turd.
Yeah, I just don't understand where they put the money, but oh well. That's my random trivia moment.
Marvelous.
Okay, now it's down to the wire, and it is our final verdict for the film. And what did you think, Conrad? Should we set it free or throw it back in the dungeon?
Well, this is a case where I kind of feel embarrassed, and I think this may happen quite often in our podcasting life together. But I pulled this one out of the Oubliette, and I had memories of it being interesting and that I kind of enjoyed it when I saw it in the 80s as a kid. But I have to say, on watching it again with fresh eyes as an adult, I think this movie stinks.
It does. I can only think of one word that describes how I feel about this movie, and that is appalled. I'm appalled at how they can throw $9 million and end up with one of the worst movies I have ever seen in my entire life. But I have to say it was funny. Unintentionally funny, but it was funny.
So you were entertained?
I was entertained, but extremely appalled at the lack of anything. Yeah. So are we setting it free or throwing it in the dungeon?
I don't think we're going to have a long discussion here.
No, not at all.
In fact, I'm tempted not to just put it back in the oubliette. I'm tempted to throw it in a shallow pit of sudsy water and blow it up.
With 6 cameras.
With 6 slow motion cameras at different angles, but that's probably cruel and unusual punishment.
So let's throw it back in there, right at the bottom, please.
Yeah, I think it should go right down the bottom with Troll 2. Hang on a second. Come here.
Oh, he's a squirmy little guy.
He really is. Okay, opening the door. And in you go.
And stay down there and never come back.
Yeah, definitely. My goodness. I'm so sorry about that one.
I mean, I still enjoyed it despite its complete lack of anything.
It's an interesting catastrophe as a film. It's an entertaining one, I think, but yes, it's definitely not something I would recommend anyone seek out.
No,
looking for.
I'm just really surprised that those 3 actors agreed to be in that film.
Yeah, it's a mystery.
So next time, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. So it's a film that we've both seen, but it's more of a childhood nostalgia film.
Childhood nostalgia.
And something I think deserves taking a look at. So the film that we'll be doing is Willow.
A Lucasfilm classic.
Which came out in 1988 and was directed by Ron Howard. Almost forgot.
Yes. Director of the new Solo Star Wars movie. We get to look at his first attempt at fantasy adventure.
Can't wait.
Should be interesting, yeah.
Thanks everyone for joining us on this episode.
Indeed, yes. And if you want to talk to us about this film, goodness knows why you would, or talk to us about other ideas for films that we could look at, then follow us on Twitter and Instagram. We are there as Movie Oubliette. If you're not sure how to spell Oubliette, it's
Oubliette.
I'm really bad at spelling. What was that?
Oubliette.
Yeah, I think that clears it up. Yes, so do follow us on our socials and give us some feedback. Another place you can give us feedback, of course, is on iTunes or your favorite podcasting platform. We would love to get your review and your star rating there. It really helps us out.
Yes, exactly. Tell us what you think. My name's Dan.
I'm Conrad.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
We review the films others tend to forget. Come with us and open up the movie Oubliette.
You have a great body. Do you mind if I use it?